distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great personal pleasure as well as an honour and a privilege to introduce Rowan Williams of Oystermouth, this evening's lecturer. Rowan Williams, as you will know him, is, I suppose, both literally and metaphorically one of the best known faces in world Christianity over the last few decades. He was, as you know, the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, having before that had a distinguished academic career at both Oxford and Cambridge, and been Bishop of Monmouth and then also Archbishop of Wales. He's also now the Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and he is also Chancellor of the University of South Wales. I could quite cheerfully take the full time of the lecture simply reading about 1/3 of Dr. Williams's biography from either Wikipedia or one other such entry somewhere. Or I could happily take the same time and tell you some interesting stories about things that he and I shared in during the years that we overlapped in the House of Bishops of the Church of England. I will simply say that as well as being one of the leading churchmen, he is of course one of the most extraordinary theologians of our day, and also somebody who's brought together at several different levels and in several different registers the tasks of theology and cultural criticism, so that one might over the last years at any moment have turned on the radio and heard him introducing Bach's St. Matthew Passion on Radio 3, or indeed debating with Richard Dawkins or Philip Pullman, or a clip from his address at the World Economics Forum, or perhaps a mention of his Gifford lectures in Edinburgh, or perhaps a discussion of his book on Dostoevsky, or on the Christian faith and art, or, just for good measure, his little and startling book on September the 11th, having, by accident as it were, one of those odd coincidences, been just round the corner at St. Thomas's Church. Do I mean St. Thomas's Church? No. Trinity Church, Wall Street, at the time when that disastrous, horrible event happened. Rowan has written widely on questions to do with Christian faith in the public square, and he's addressed also numerous issues of pastoral, spiritual and exegetical theology, writing just as comfortably for the people in the pew, as it were, as for the academics. He has honorary fellowships at 2 Oxford and 2 Cambridge colleges. He's written over 40 books, many other distinctions. Perhaps I should say that since his topic tonight is what is consciousness, and he has just over a few hours ago got off an aeroplane from Seattle, maybe he will be a living example of consciousness as well as able to enlighten us about it. So without more ado, please join me in welcoming Rowan Williams.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom, and thank you for the warning about the possible lapses of consciousness that may result from jet lag in the next hour or so. Anyone volunteering to speak on a subject as broad as this probably deserves all the opprobrium that he or she will attract. But it's only when some people occasionally take rash risks that interesting questions get generated. And so I hope very much that in these very amateur reflections on an exceptionally wide-ranging field of controversy, I hope that at some point some such interesting questions will be generated. It's a major issue, the question of consciousness, in neuroscience and in philosophy, and a set of questions which of course impacts very directly on many of the things that theologians or ethicists most want to talk about. So although I won't be talking very much this evening about theology as such, I hope that some of the trails I lay may suggest the kind of theological questions and theological possibilities which arise from thinking through this fundamental question about what it is to be human. But before embarking on one or two more detailed questions, let me begin with a general observation. The question, what is consciousness, is now a question that is best and most effectively addressed, it seems, on the frontiers of a number of different disciplines. So that the kind of book which has this kind of title will very often draw from physics, neuroscience in particular, philosophy, psychology, literature, and many other fields. It's a helpful reminder that some of the rigid divisions of subject matter that so often afflict the academy won't quite cut it when fundamental issues are at stake. And this has both positive and negative effects. Positive because conversations between different academic areas are, of course, always among the most fertile things that happen in universities. Negative because some of the literature that can come out of this may be lacking in the rigour that applies in any one of those areas left to themselves. Some of what I say later will, I hope, help to identify some of the areas where lack of rigour is a problem. And doubtless a great deal more of what I say will illustrate the problem of lack of rigour in other ways. But I think it is worth beginning by reminding ourselves of this very significant fact in our intellectual climate at the moment. While we talk, and talk freely, about ours being a very specialised era, where people go more narrowly and deeply into questions than perhaps once they did, it's also the case that the issues that confront us as a human race are issues which require a certain amount of multilingual skill. That is, of course, one of the things which a good university exists to promote, and I'm very happy indeed that this university is one which promotes precisely those things. And I'm honoured and delighted to be back here to address such a dangerous and I hope fertile topic. So let me begin with two negative points about recent discussions of consciousness in some of the literature. There is a consensus in many quarters, philosophical and scientific, that one thing we can confidently say about consciousness or the mind is that it is a kind of machine. A very recent book, last year in fact, on the problem of consciousness, by Stanislas Dehaene, concludes by saying there is really no problem in describing human beings as machines with free will. I'll give some reasons for thinking there are problems in a moment, but I underline for the moment the interest of that metaphor of the machine. Consciousness is mechanical. The brain is a kind of machine. The brain is a kind of computer, we frequently hear. Therefore, what we most need to know about consciousness is what the operations are of this machine. The other frequent consensus perspective that is offered by philosophers and scientists on this follows from that. If consciousness is machine-like in important or definitive ways, then of course it is a mistake to think that consciousness is, of its nature, something which registers what is the case. At its most extreme, this leads some writers to say the idea of consciousness is a mistake itself. Others have said less radically that there are no thoughts which are thoughts of anything. A thought is an operation within the machine's workings. So, to start off, I want to try and clear away the confusions which seem to me inherent in both of those ways of looking at the question. Beginning with the machine. The problem of thinking of consciousness as machine-like, the brain as a computer, whatever, is that, of course, this is a metaphor, but a metaphor with a particularly complicated set of associations that come with it. A machine exists in order to solve problems. Problems that are extraneous to itself. We design mechanical processes in order to produce specified functions. A machine fails if it does not deliver the function we have specified for it. So that an internal combustion engine, which fails to drive a car but very satisfactorily boils eggs, is not a good machine. But in what sense can we say that consciousness in general, the brain in particular, is a machine in that sense? Is it something which exists in order to solve problems extraneous to itself? Prima facie, the answer has to be no. At the very least, and most reductive, a brain is an organism. And an organism is not a machine. Organisms solve their own problems. In evolutionary history, organisms develop in order to deal with their own crises of adjustment to the environment. But they're not there in order to solve problems outside themselves. So as soon as that language of the machine comes into play, we have a major conceptual definitional problem. And I think as soon as such language occurs in this discussion, it needs at once to be flagged with all kinds of warning marks. It's also interesting, and I'll come back to this a bit later, that the machine model tends to assume that the fundamental form of causality in the world is mechanical. The most important, the most basic causal relations are mechanical, entirely matters of input and output, not even of stimulus and response. And that elides the many difficulties that still lie around the very notion of causality in science and elsewhere. It carries with it a set of assumptions too about materiality, which once again I'll return to later on. And it rather ignores the extremely complicated questions of how information and the exchange of information, both in natural and constructed systems, works causally. It ignores the issues of the emergent properties of more and more complex systems. It ignores the perspective offered by what is usually referred to as holism, that is the way in which something may be more than the sum of its parts and have properties as a whole which do not correspond to the properties of any of its component parts. So the machine model is one which we ought immediately to question. And of course, if we do so question it, then there is less incentive to think that the language of consciousness might be a mistake, or that we might have to conclude that thoughts are thoughts about nothing in particular. But of course, as soon as we've articulated that, we see that there are intrinsic problems with that as well. Being mistaken is something that happens to consciousnesses. Internal combustion engines don't make mistakes. Machines do not make mistakes. They malfunction. But the notion of a mistake, that is, a perception, a categorization of the world being a bad fit with what is the case, that is something which we associate with consciousness itself. If you're at all interested in how to represent propositions logically, it's actually not possible to represent coherently the idea that consciousness is a mistake if you define consciousness, as we are bound to, as the sort of thing that makes mistakes. There's an infinite regress. Similarly, thoughts of nothing. If I say my thoughts are thoughts about nothing, of course I'm articulating a thought which is about thoughts. And again, I cannot get out of that particular loop. Even within our thinking about thinking, we can make a distinction between thinking of different sorts of nothing. Bear with me. I can say I'm thinking of a square circle. Well, I'm there quite literally thinking of nothing. There is nothing that could conceivably correspond to that. There is no coherent, logical way of representing that thought. I can say I'm thinking of a unicorn. I can think of a picture of what, as a matter of fact, is a non-existent creature. I'm thinking about nothing that is actually instantiated in the world, but something which has a certain kind of symbolic or legendary identity. Or I can think about things that are really there. I can think not about unicorns, but about zebras. And then I'm thinking of something. But the point of that rather laboured excursion is simply that our thoughts are, as thoughts, intentional. The thought of a thought is the thought of something that is about something. And once again, we're back to the question of definition. If consciousness is a mistake, I'm already importing consciousness into the word mistake. If thought is of nothing but itself, I'm importing into thought, or rather exporting from thought, the assumption we always make about our thinking that it is about something, even if it is about the emptiness of thought. As I say, bear with me, it's not all as bad as this. But my point in starting with these two negative categorizations is simply to put down some very clear markers about the easy mistakes that are made sometimes by those who don't approach this question with enough philosophical rigour. Consciousness is a machine and consciousness is a mistake may both have a certain glamour, a certain seductive simplicity about them as statements. Neither of them can be made to make sense. And so whatever we say at the end of the day about the relation between consciousness and the material world, between the self and the brain, we cannot reduce it to either of those propositions. But if those two negatives are set aside, if the reductionist consensus is rejected, what then are the positives we might engage in? In the next part of what I want to say, I'd like to suggest 4 aspects of our language and thinking about consciousness, which may go a little further towards answering the rashly ambitious question which forms the title of this lecture. First of all, then, when we speak of human consciousness, we speak of something that is located somewhere. My consciousness is this point of view. It's what's characterized by the first person singular. It is a strategy by which this material identity here charts a path through a material environment. It's sometimes been said that human knowledge begins in the experience of bumping into things, quite literally, as a child, and finding one's way around them, so that one stops bumping into them, sooner or later. But of course, it's not just about the material self charting a path through material objects. I mentioned a moment ago the ways in which information works in our world. The world of cause and interaction in which we live is not, with due respect to 17th century and indeed sometimes 21st century models, a world in which small solid objects bump against each other and the world is a very, very large snooker table. Change happens and interaction happens because information is exchanged. And information may be exchanged at very simple, very basic molecular levels, and it may also be exchanged, as it's being exchanged, I hope, this evening, in slightly less materially confined ways, by words being spoken, associations being awoken in those hearing, and fresh configurations of language appearing. My location as a consciousness is not just my ability to map a world of stuff and things around me, It's also my capacity to map a world of communication, to place myself within a network of interchange of information from the molecular level to the level of speech and concept. I live in a world where I don't simply bump into things, but a world where I bump into signs. That is, things which communicate, which trigger further symbolic communication, which produce further utterance and make a difference at that level. Consciousness is located within the material world, within the world of language, about which more later. To try and think through what we mean habitually, non-technically, by consciousness, without registering that fundamental reality of a location, what one philosopher called a 0 point of orientation, is to misunderstand the nature of the question. But now, if consciousness is located, localized to this point of orientation, if it's a matter of charting lines to relations with other material agents, realities, processes, and symbolic processes, then of course the notion of relatedness becomes equally key to the idea of consciousness. And so the second positive point I want to make about consciousness has to do with relationality. The way in which having a point of view here, my 0 point of orientation, takes for granted that there are other points of orientation. For me to be aware of being here is also to be aware of others being there. Let's take this a bit further. If my presence here is a matter of my decoding the signs that are given to me materially and in other ways around me, decoding those signs, registering and decoding the information I receive, requires me to do some imagining, to imagine another point of view. My consciousness is not simply registering a lot of impressions that are coming to me from, again, a mechanical world generating impressions outside. I don't simply render and register the stimuli I receive passively. I engage in a kind of systematized guesswork. I put myself in the position of another. I understand that while I can't see the back of my head, you can. I understand that while I am speaking, you may be imagining many things and raising all kinds of interesting questions in your minds about when this lecture is going to finish or when it's going to begin making sense or whatever. I, as speaker, imagine my hearers. I imagine what makes sense. But much more than that, much more basically than that, to have a sense of any object, including my own body, is to presuppose a number of points of view, because I can't see the backs of your heads. I assume they're there because I put myself in the position of those who can. I construct a synoptic, a walking around picture of an object, a person, something I encounter, by imagining the other point of view. But I can't even imagine my own body, as a unit, without imagining another point of view. To think of myself as a body, to be conscious of myself as a body, is inseparably to be conscious of other people's consciousness. So, that's my second positive point. Consciousness, as we normally think about it, has a relational dimension. I can't think me without thinking the other. I can't even think of my body, this 0 point of orientation, without understanding that it's an object to another. I am seen, I am heard, I am understood. And whether I'm talking about myself in the most general and vague sense, or talking about my body as a specific organic unit, I am bound to be imagining what is not within imagining other points of view. To have a point of view is to understand that the world consists of points of view. And so that means that my consciousness is mobile, engaged, incomplete, because I can't construct the idea of any object without supposing a diversity of points of view. I know that my own point of view is always partial. And to be conscious of myself is to be aware of myself as a node, a point in a web of information exchange which corporately constructs the idea of objects, selves, persons. To be conscious is, I've suggested primitively, to be able to find my way around the material environment without bumping into things. It's to calculate distance and speed. As, for example, when another physical object, like a human body, is coming towards me. Am I going to bump into that person? But it's also about how I read a face. What are the signs that are being given by the person I'm speaking to or listening to? It's about being able to argue to a wider context than that which is simply defined by what is being registered primitively as stimuli for my senses now. Consciousness is cooperative. And it's in this light, I think, that we ought to reflect on some of the remarkable work of writers like Ian McGilchrist, a neuroscientist with philosophical, literary and indeed theological capacity, who notes that because of the bicameral nature of the brain, there are different kinds of awareness operative. One cluster of operations dealing with detail, small-scale recognition, the other dealing with constructive, connecting perception. And while that's a very crude breakdown of how the hemispheres of the brain work, it's not completely misleading in that it reminds us that our habitual, unexamined consciousness actually works in widely diverse ways. We see how that works to some extent when we see what happens in the case of malfunction. So that the situation of someone, and there are such cases, who can recognize noses, eyes, mouths, but not faces, becomes a kind of carrier for understanding how our consciousness collaboratively, within its own organic terms, puts together objects as objects. Part of our brain is a set of operations, making the connections, allowing larger pictures to be seen, allowing us to know by imagining, not simply by registering. Interestingly, one of the most significant contributions to this subject was made about 100 years ago by a young German woman philosopher, Edith Stein, a pupil of the great philosopher Edmund Husserl, and someone who worked on his own manuscripts and worked them up for publication. She published in 1916 a doctoral dissertation on empathy, the problem of empathy, in which she argued very effectively and with great sophistication that consciousness itself was collaborative, empathetic, in the sense that to be conscious of anything, one had to have the capacity to imagine another point of view. It anticipates by several decades some of the work done after the Second World War in France by another of the great philosophers of the century, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And Edith Stein's work is significant for some of us, not least because, to the great surprise of many, she converted from Judaism to Roman Catholicism, became a Carmelite nun, and died in Auschwitz, where what she had written about consciousness and empathy was, I have no doubt, something rather more than an academic set of challenges. So that's my second positive area. If consciousness is local, about a point of view, it's also, intrinsically, about several interlocking or intersecting points of view. It's collaborative. It's social, simply in the sense that to imagine any thing, person, object, including my own body, I need to imagine the other as seeing. And that leads on to a third positive category about consciousness. My point of view, my first-person perspective, is something which is always constructed, articulated, and explored, partly in terms of where it's come from. I assume continuity. I assume that even if I move around this platform, my point of view remains, in an important sense, constant. I don't lose consciousness simply by moving to the other side of the stage. I assume there's an identity between perceptions and interactions of which I have been part in the past and what is now going on. The constant shifts of physical movement and the lapse of time don't dissolve the notion that the point of view I inhabit, the first person which I articulate, is a consistent, a continuous reality. And despite assaults from both philosophy and bits of the neuroscientific world, it's extremely difficult to know how we would begin to talk about consciousness without that sense of continuity in time. Which means that the third positive category we might apply to consciousness is narrative. Consciousness is local, it's relational, and it's narrative. It's something fixed with reference to past situations as well as present stimuli. It's involved at the most simple level with recognition of stimuli as continuous with previous stimuli. It's also, of course, confusingly and often disturbingly tied in with memory, images of the past, whose function we can't easily determine. My capacity to remember what I don't need to remember, and indeed what I don't want to remember at times, is one of those burdens of consciousness about which people write so much. I recall a poignant moment when a very senior academic of my acquaintance many years ago spoke of the curse of near-total recall, overdeveloped memory, an inability to forget or marginalize painful and difficult recollections. It's another of those things that's not captured at all well by the machine model of consciousness. We don't know, and we can't know at any given moment exactly what function is served by the floating bits of memory that come in and out of awareness. But our consciousness draws in those floating impressions from the past, works on the assumption that they are part of a single story, and very often, of course, works over time to synthesize or make sense of those floating impressions. There is an intrinsic significance in our understanding of consciousness, in history, of doing and being done to. So, that history of what we've done and what has been done to us, shaping awareness now, is something which we must register as a central part of what it is to be conscious, and also gives us a new perspective on that relationality that I mentioned earlier. Because not only do I narrate, tell a story about myself, I'm also aware that I'm somebody about whom stories are told. Others see me as a continuum, as I see myself. And as any conversation at any depth will reveal, the stories that other people tell about me are not necessarily the stories I would tell or want to tell about myself. Anybody who's spent any time in public life will, of course, feel this rather acutely. Ask Ed Miliband, among others. But there we are. I am a narrator, but I'm also narrated. I'm an agent, but I am acted upon. I see and I am seen. And to be conscious is therefore to be aware not simply of being a subject, a first-person agent, this location, it's also to be aware of being an object, someone spoken about, someone of whom stories are told. And so, fourthly, and finally, among these positive characterizations of consciousness, consciousness is always bound up with language. That's not to say that I have no thoughts that don't come to words. It's not to say that my consciousness is a complete verbal catalogue of the things that happen to me in my mind, which is an immense set, a whole bundle of philosophical misunderstandings. But consciousness is tied up with language. It's not the deliberate registering of the contents of the mind, but it's bound in with the capacity to respond to and to develop or complicate the basic information exchanges which are going on in me at every level. Or to put it in plain English, speaking changes things. To say something introduces new possibilities. And to be conscious, to be part of this narrative, relational, localized life, which I've described as the life of consciousness, is to be a speaker. Somebody generating signs and symbols, an agent inviting, listening, interpretation, and so on. Speaking changes things. And to put it in its most provocative, a theory of evolution potentially changes how evolution works. When we have a theory about how something in the world around us works, we have implicitly a capacity to make a difference to that working. So our language, our generation of symbols, our invitation to interpretation and exchange is, it seems, intrinsic to this picture of consciousness as embedded in relation and locality and storytelling. It's because of all these things, of course, that the malfunctions or disorders of consciousness are so painful to us. Those whose spatial sense is distorted, those whose awareness of relationality is limited, those whose memory has been affected by developments within their brain, those who lose symbol-generating capacity will never have it. All of such human persons we recognize on the one hand as persons and as persons wrestling with exceptional challenge. We don't write them off as persons, nor do we think they're simply an ordinary variation of the type. Which is why, in thinking through issues around consciousness, I found personally some of the most suggestive, creative and challenging insights come from looking at how people work with those living with autistic conditions, for example, or with varying kinds of dementia. It's when we see malfunction or challenge of this nature that we begin to see what we take for granted. And in doing so, as I say, we don't write off another as lacking consciousness. We are driven back to ask some basic questions about what, therefore, we mean by consciousness and what it is precisely, that has gone wrong. So, before moving on to my final section, let me just recap once more. Negatively speaking, I've attempted to put on one side the popular but I think deeply fallacious models that regard consciousness as machinery or mistake. And I've argued that in our habitual reflection on how consciousness works, we assume, pretty much without argument, a number of aspects without which we couldn't begin to make sense of the use of this word. Locality, relationality, narrative, language. And it's surprising and sometimes rather dismaying that some quite technical discussions of the problem of consciousness, whether scientific or philosophical, in the last decade or two, have been rather reluctant to engage with some of these features, notably with the issue of language. But in my final section of remarks, I want to do two things. One is simply to ask the question of where the reductive passion comes from. And the second, you won't be surprised, is to trail a few little theological thoughts before you, to see where this might go as we take it into another area. But first of all, why the reductive passion? Why the concern to insist on mechanism and mistake? Raymond Tallis, a philosopher who will be known to some of you in his book Reflections of a Metaphysical Flaneur, has some very apposite reflections on this. One essay has the unforgettable title, "You Chemical Scum, You." It begins with the words, "I am sick of being insulted. There seems to be a competition among some contemporary thinkers to dream up the most hostile descriptions of Homo sapiens, a species of which I am proud to be an example." And he quotes from a number of distinguished scientists, including the great Stephen Hawking, who have come out with excitingly and strikingly reductive accounts of humanity. The human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet, orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among a billion galaxies. Stephen Hawking, in the 1990s, hence the title, "You Chemical Scum, You." Tallis raises and begins to answer, I think, the question of why it is that there seems to be such a passion to reduce what we can say about the conscious mind, let alone the freedom of the will. And I think there are at least three things going on here. The first is something I touched on very briefly earlier, and that is a simple philosophical crudity about causality, materiality, and matters like that. We are tempted constantly to look for the basic structure, that to which everything can be reduced. All of biology is really chemistry. All of chemistry is really physics. All of physics is really mathematics. All of mathematics, that's when things get a bit complicated. But the point is that the reductive concern, extremely important for certain practical purposes, can become a search for the least adorned, the most fundamental pattern or structure we can come up with, while ignoring the fact that this, in Tallis's words again, makes all appearances disappear. Nothing is really a thing. When we have said that everything can be reduced to this or that equation, we have actually said nothing of any great substance. We have simply said there is a mathematical process without which this would not be what it is. But given what's already been said about the emergent properties of complex systems, the fact that there are wholes whose capacities and properties are more than any of their parts. Reductionism as a systematic global principle is simply, again, intellectually incoherent. That there are more organised, more complex ways of describing a set of physical phenomena is not a matter of the scum on the water. It's a matter of recognising that with any situation, any set of circumstances in the material world, there will be a variety of proper descriptions depending on where you're sitting. It's perfectly true that a performance of Bach's solo cello suites is a set of physical operations. Catgut and string cooperate in producing certain vibrations. The usefulness of that as a description of what is going on, the usefulness of it, for example, in adjudicating between the different interpretations of Paul Tortelier and Yo-Yo Ma of the Bach cello suites is nil. And we need to recall that what seems to be a compelling reductive version is telling you nothing, except that this is an intrinsic element in a complex reality. Behind that reductionism, as again I've suggested, lies what's often an unexamined notion of matter. Daniel Dennett, a philosopher for whom I have a great deal of respect, unfortunately, has said that we have to recall, bear in mind in any discussion of consciousness, that there is only one kind of stuff. And while that's very tempting, I want to know a little bit more about what he means by stuff. Because, of course, the world is not full of stuff. The world is a very, very complex set of interactions of information-bearing energy. And when you've said that, and recognise that the word information is, as the professionals say, analogical, that is, it works at a number of different levels in interestingly different ways, it's no longer particularly interesting to say there's one sort of stuff. The world we inhabit is not a world in which little solid things bump into each other and nudge each other around. The world we inhabit is a world in which information and instruction, interesting we use these metaphors, is conveyed through material exchanges of energy. And the more we analyse those material exchanges of energy, the less it looks like little bits of stuff. That's, of course, Physics 101 for the last century and more. So, my first guess at a diagnosis of why this sort of reductionism is popular would simply be, I'm afraid, that there is a real and often toxic lack of philosophical precision and even consistency within the language being used. My second suggested diagnosis is a little bit more aggressive. Wittgenstein said in the 1930s, "It is charming to destroy prejudice." That's to say, if somebody tells you that X is really only Y, that's very, very attractive. If somebody can tell you that you needn't bother about certain aspects of reality because what is really going on is this, you have made a very powerful, compelling, and seductive statement. You have admitted somebody to an inner circle of those who know, capital letters, what is really going on. And we all know how immensely appealing that is. To be told that we are nothing but chemical scum gives us, paradoxically, the thrill of being insiders. We are the chemical scum who know we are chemical scum. That is a powerful, appealing, cool position to be in. Power is an issue here, and it's one of those aspects of this whole question which, again, I feel is insufficiently discussed. To speculate about consciousness as mechanical or mistaken, to say there is no such thing as a point of view, may be an agreeable fantasy within the pages of a scientific textbook. It is rather different when applied to the reality of an actual other person and their point of view. It is rather difficult to deduce from that any kind of ethical seriousness about human diversity. I said a moment ago that reductivism is a permission to ignore. And I would say that any intellectual strategy which gives you permission to ignore some level of legitimate description is morally deeply dangerous, as well as being, I think, philosophically incoherent. But the charm remains, the admission to the inner circle, those who really know. My third and final point leads on to some concluding unscientific and vaguely theological reflections. Much more speculatively, I suspect that the animus of certain kinds of scientist and philosopher towards the models of consciousness and indeed of freedom or of personal identity that I've been working with reflects a faint residual feeling that there is something about consciousness which intrinsically leaves the question of the sacred on the table. Consciousness as local, yet also relational, as receptive and also creative, as narrative, as having to do with speaking and being spoken about, seeing and being seen, as the generation of symbol, is something which fits and sits, if not comfortably, at least coherently, with that model of the universe which religious people, on the whole, take for granted. The model of a universe in which intelligibility and intelligence are omnipresent. There is no such thing as dead matter. There is always a speaking, an invitation, a summons to engage, which, for the theologian, is bound up with the nature of creation itself. The idea that all that we are, as a finite set of systems in the universe, is what it is because it responds to a fundamental communication of intelligence or information, or indeed communion. Receptivity and cooperation, the sense of limit and incompletion, symbol and the transparency of symbols, all of these have their natural location in a kind of human discourse that takes for granted what I call the sacred in general, and what I'm much happier in calling God. Within the context of a doctrine of creation, as making sense against the background of a God whose will or purpose, character it is to share what his life is. To elaborate that further would of course lead us straight into the considerations of doctrine, which are not the primary purpose of this evening's reflection. But I hope that in what I've said so far about this vastly complicated and enticing and frustrating borderland where philosophy and physics and psychology and theology blend, what I've said so far about this may just make some sense of what many have wanted to say in the last century and more, which is that a loss of the sense of the sacred, a loss of the sense of being answerable to an intelligible gift from beyond ourselves, in the long run, entails more than simply the loss of God. It may entail the loss of the distinctively human. And if I wanted to identify one of the greatest intellectual challenges of our day, it is that pervasive sense that we are in danger of losing our sense of the human. Whether or not any of you would agree that to recover a sense of the human you have to turn to theology, I won't take for granted. I note that there are impressive and sophisticated critics of reductionism, including Raymond Tallis and, of course, John Gray, whose recent book, The Soul of the Marionette, raises some of these questions. Impressive thinkers who do not move from the argument against reductionism to an argument for theism. And that's an interesting argument to have. But the question is undoubtedly on the table. The loss of the human, the philosophy that some people describe as transhuman, the notion that we can become more than human, that our organic identity can be superseded by various kinds of cyber technology, all of that ought to make us anxious about where exactly we look for anchoring our sense of the distinctively human, anchoring confidence in our own consciousness. And while I don't delude myself for a moment that I have answered the question in the title of this lecture, I hope that these few remarks may at least have illustrated why it's a question that matters immensely to us as a culture, and why some of the popular and superficially simple responses to the question won't do logically, psychologically, or even scientifically.